It starts with the scoreboard. Democrats swept major races on Tuesday. Not a moral victory, not a messy split. A clean, visible set of wins that cut across geography and demographic lines. That matters because political parties can stomach a loss if they see a trend that favors them next time. What they cannot stomach is a pattern that looks like erosion. Suburban voters staying gone, young voters turning out with purpose, and key communities, especially Hispanic voters, in places like New Jersey, shifting harder than expected. When you add that up, you do not get a hiccup, you get a verdict. Now drop yourself inside the White House room where Donald Trump gathers GOP senators. The cameras are on. Donald Trump starts with something approaching candor. I do not think it was good for Republicans. That is not spin. That is a tell. He pivots fast, blaming the lack of Trump on the ballot, blaming the shutdown, promising a private real talk after the press leaves. The subtext is simple. He knows the night was bad, but he cannot let the narrative harden into accountability. That is the core tension of the disaster meeting, admission without ownership. It sets the tone for everything that follows. Let us pass his explanations one by one. First, the idea that results would have flipped if Donald Trump himself were on the ballot. That is wishful thinking, and it avoids the inconvenient reality that many voters have spent years reacting to, his presence by voting against whoever he is backing. Second, the shutdown blame. The polling on shutdowns is nearly always brutal for the party seen as forcing them, and Donald Trump knows it. Yet he dances around the fact that the shutdown brinkmanship is deeply tied to the most hardline demands coming from his wing. If you fuel the standoff, you own the backlash. That is Politics 101. Look at the players in the room. Mike Johnson, also called MAGA Mike, tries to steady the ship by insisting the losses were not about Republicans, that people are just angry and frustrated, and that the GOP will run on its record and expand its numbers. It is confident language that does not match the map. J.D. Vance gets praise from Donald Trump, called Vice President J.D. Vance with a flourish, and the applause fills the space. Names matter here because they tell you who is being positioned as an heir or a validator. Donald Trump, Mike Johnson, J.D. Vance. This is the axis he wants people to see, a straight line from party apparatus to loyalists. But applause does not neutralize the scoreboard. Voters did not clap back. They walked to polling places and answered. Now the rhetoric that followed. Donald Trump reaches for a comparison so clumsy it lands like a lead weight, calling Democrats kamikaze pilots and fumbling a reference to a prime minister Taki. In moments like that, you are seeing a political instinct that leans into insult over insight. It is meant to project confidence and contempt for the other side, but it does something else. It shrinks the space for persuasion. You are not winning wary moderates or soft partisans with a sloppy analogy that stereotypes another country and misses the name. You are feeding your own echo chamber while alienating everyone who wants a governing plan. Then came the Xi Jinping anecdote. Donald Trump recalls the discipline of staffers who stood silently and stiffly. He praises the posture. He wants his cabinet to behave like that. That line is revealing. Leadership by fear might look efficient in a tableau, but it is poison in a democracy. A president who equates respect with silence and order with fear is broadcasting a management style that prefers obedience to debate. That matters, because if you build a team to avoid eye contact and nod on cue, you are building a team that will not tell you uncomfortable truths. And last night's results are nothing if not an uncomfortable truth. On voter ID and mail voting, Donald Trump replays the old script. You need ID for groceries and gas, so why not for voting? Mail ballots are automatically corrupt. The problem is that neither claim resolves the obvious. Voters have shown up under a variety of voting systems and sent messages that have nothing to do with whether the line requires a driver license or whether ballots arrive by mail. Voters are measuring pocketbooks, stability, and whether their leaders treat them like adults. They see cost of living, healthcare access, and whether chaos is the plan. If your answer to affordability is to shout about mail ballots, you are answering a question voters did not ask. Now to SNAP and the safety net. Donald Trump frames benefits as bloated and misused, a pot that grew because they were given to anybody that wanted them. It is an applause line that tells a bigger story. They are betting that suspicion of your neighbor will beat your own memory of how the safety net worked for a friend, a cousin, or your family during a rough stretch. But Tuesday's numbers suggest many voters, including working-class voters and young voters, are not buying the blanket narrative that help is theft. You do not have to love every program to reject the idea that hardship equals a con. And if your pitch is pain as proof of strength, you will lose people who can do the math on groceries and rent. The justice system moment matters too. Donald Trump brags about firing people if Democrats praise them. Read that closely. If the other side likes you, you are out, even if you are qualified, even if you are a Republican. That is loyalty over law, vibes over vetting. In healthy institutions, bipartisan praise is a signal of credibility. In this telling, it is a red flag. And this is happening in the same political weather pattern, where a federal magistrate judge, Fitzpatrick, demands grand jury minutes and search materials in a high-profile case, calling the procedural posture highly unusual. That is a serious court, using measured language to raise serious concerns. When judges apply sunlight, political narratives get stress-tested. If your choices cannot pass a procedural sniff test, you do not double down. You course correct, unless fear of admitting error outweighs the cost of continuing to be wrong. Zoom out to the Supreme Court thread. Neil Gorsuch presses the government lawyer, John Sauer, on whether the president could slap a massive tariff on gas cars by invoking an emergency, essentially asking if the executive can legislate by fiat. That is not a small question. It cuts to the heart of how a presidency wields power when Congress will not cooperate. If your theory gives the White House a blank check, courts will notice. And if you have built your brand on breaking norms to get results, you will also find yourself running into the last guardrails that still work. In other words, in one morning you had electoral guardrails and judicial guardrails lighting up at the same time. Back to the voters. The chatter about Hispanic voters is not an abstraction. Look at precincts where Spanish is the second language in every bodega line, and where families talk policy at kitchen tables, not cable panels. When shifts that large show up in those neighborhoods, they are not guessing. They are reacting to what they lived. And when 18 and 19-year-olds show up, it is not because a famous figure told them to. It is because they felt a proposition in their feed, took 5 minutes for research, and decided to own an outcome. That is not a youth quake headline. That is a pipeline forming. You do not reverse that with a slogan. You meet it with specifics that respect how these voters think, work, study, rent, and dream. There is a reason Tuesday's pattern frightened seasoned operatives more than the raw totals. It is the confluence young voters turning from cynicism to action, suburban voters sticking with their last few cycles of choices, and key communities shifting at the margins that decide close races. When those three currents align, you are not one speech away from fixing it. You are a cycle or two away if you change, and you are many cycles away if you do not. And the disaster meeting told us they are not changing. They are reciting. Mike Johnson says it was not about Republicans. J.D. Vance gets the gold star moment. Donald Trump promises to talk after the press leaves. The ranks close. The plan does not. Let us unpack the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico line. Donald Trump warns that if Democrats get power, they will make the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico states, add 4 senators, pick up electors, and lock in forever. It is classic wedge framing. Paint the other side's structural proposals as an existential threat, so your side can justify extraordinary measures now. But voters who just chose competence over chaos are not sprinting toward a plan. That sounds like rush everything through before the next election. You can only run government like a lame duck speed run if the public trusts your motives. They do not. That is the point of Tuesday. Gavin Newsom's name comes up for a reason. His media strategy, podcasts, debates, rapid response content, reaches audiences Donald Trump assumes he owns, and audiences Donald Trump never even tries to reach. When Donald Trump argues that filibuster termination is the only way to pass anything, he is amplifying the fear that process is the problem. But Tuesday told you the problem is substance and tone. If you want to pass things, you need to earn trust. If you want to keep things passed, you need to maintain it. Process changes do not substitute for proof of work. People can feel lower costs, safer communities, visible competence. Now to Mike Johnson again. His insistence that nothing about the losses implicates Republicans is precisely why the losses will continue. When a quarterback throws 3 interceptions and says, the receivers ran the wrong routes, you know exactly what the next game will look like. Leadership requires saying out loud what everyone else already fears. We got beat in places we should not get beat. We keep answering cost of living questions with culture war monologues. We turned fiscal prudence into shutdown theater. We talk posture and grind while voters want stability and specificity. That is the speech that changes a trajectory. It is not the speech we heard. Let us talk J.D. Vance by name, because Donald Trump did. Elevating J.D. Vance in that room serves two purposes. It flatters a loyalist and signals to Senate Republicans that the price of good standing is alignment. But that strategy locks you into a narrower coalition at the exact moment the map demands a broader one. When suburban parents, young renters, and working-class service workers coalesce around stability, you have to expand the circle. If your inner circle shrinks instead, you are not building a majority. You are curating a fandom. And about Neil Gorsuch and John Sauer, those names should ring in Republican ears. If a justice appointed by a Republican president is asking whether your legal theory turns emergencies into catch-all rationales for unilateral action, you have a serious separation of powers problem. Courts do not like being turned into bystanders. Congress does not like being turned into a prop. Voters do not like being told their choices come second to executive improvisation. If your governing theory is, trust me, you need to be trusted, talk to Tuesday's voters about whether that trust exists. Judge Fitzpatrick's order in the James Comey matter belongs in the same paragraph, not because it is the same law, but because it is the same theme. Process matters because it protects legitimacy. When a judge forces disclosure of grand jury minutes and search protocols, the message is that shortcuts are not a flex. They are a liability. Public confidence depends on the impression that cases are built by evidence, not by timelines. If the takeaway from the judge is this posture is highly unusual, and your brand is, we do not lose, you are holding a contradiction that will break under pressure. Let us linger on the culture of fear Donald Trump described admiring in that meeting with Xi Jinping. Leaders who seek fear get silence. Silence breeds bad decisions. Bad decisions trigger electoral backlash. Backlash triggers more demands for fear. It is a loop. Healthy organizations are not quiet. They are candid. They argue. They refine. They improve. If the GOP internal dynamic becomes a posture contest instead of a policy workshop, the party becomes less resilient, not more. Tuesday's results are what happens when you mistake intimidation for loyalty and slogans for plans. The youth pipeline is the most durable part of this story. 18 and 19-year-olds are not ideologues in the way cable panels imagine them. They are students and hourly workers and apprentice coders and young parents who are allergic to nonsense. They want tuition paths that do not feel like traps, starter jobs that do not feel like dead ends, rent that does not eat the month. They will absolutely vote for whoever makes their lives visibly better. They can also smell contempt from a mile away. When they hear leaders mock their platforms, they do not argue back. They mobilize elsewhere. That is exactly what the Proposition 50 interviews showed. They heard. They looked it up. They moved. If you keep dismissing their channels, you will keep losing their votes. Now, about Hispanic voters and the shifts observed in places like New Jersey municipalities. Parties win when they speak to aspiration with specificity, small business credit, fair lending, safe neighborhoods, good schools, and dignity in how government talks about families. Parties lose when they treat communities as talking points. Tuesday looked like a lot of people deciding they are done with being caricatured. You cannot write them off and then wonder why they do not show up for you. You have to show up first, consistently, with something to offer besides a lecture. This brings us back to the disaster meeting itself. In a moment that called for humility and a reset, Donald Trump offered flattery for J.D. Vance, a shrug for Mike Johnson to repeat, and a promise that the real talk would happen when the press left. But if the real talk is just the same memes without microphones, you have not changed the inputs. And if you do not change inputs, the outputs will look a lot like Tuesday again and again. Donald Trump, Mike Johnson, J.D. Vance, Neil Gorsuch, John Sauer, Xi Jinping, Gavin Newsom, James Comey, Pam Bondi, Lindsay Halligan, Magistrate Judge Fitzpatrick. Learn the names, because each one marks a different pressure point in the system. Electoral, institutional, legal, cultural. The meeting tied them into one thread, a party hoping that posture can substitute for persuasion, and that discipline can substitute for delivery. Voters just said it cannot. So what actually changes outcomes from here? Accountability first. Say plainly that chaos costs seats. That shutdown theater alienates the very families you claim to champion. That telling people their ballots are fake is not a strategy to win them back. That praising fear as order is not strength, it is insecurity. Then substance. Show people bills that target cost of living, not just press conferences. Put your name on compromises that survive contact with reality. Build credibility by doing something that is both popular and boring. Because boring is often what stability feels like.